how to do a lower flat plane in D3 Splint. As you can see, I've already imported my STLs here. So the next step is going to be to switch this to a mandibular appliance, and I'm going to stick with flat plane. So now when we set the splint model, you're going to choose the lower, and then when you set the opposing, you're going to pick the upper and set landmarks as normal. As you can see, I don't have this last molar back here, so I'm going to go to the farthest back molar there is on the left side. And as long as this is even and balanced, I'm going to be in pretty good shape. I'd say that's pretty good. I'll go ahead and confirm. And now this was scanned in a closed bite, so I need to go ahead and open my pin. I'm going to check clearance and click change pin setting to begin opening my pin. If I had to guess, I'm probably going to start at a 3.5. And that is completely clear. And as you can see, I have this tiny dot of green, and that's it. So in truth, I could probably close this a little bit more based on the molars, but actually I'm going to run through the articulator and check and see my clearance in the anterior quick. Yeah, right here I start to get some red. So I may leave it at the 3.5. That's just a little bit of red. Let's see. To change your pin setting, you do need to bring this back to the beginning. I'm going to actually open it just another 0.2. A reminder that these numbers are cumulative, so it will add or subtract whatever value you put in here. So if I were to put a negative 0.2, it would close 0.2. Let me check my protrusion again. Yeah, that's looking much better. And you can see I'm getting this little red flare right here from this little tag in my scan. That is soft tissue area, so I'm not actually worried about that. If you're worried about it showing up in the excursion process, we can actually go in and paint out and delete that. So I'm going to turn off my check clearance and return to home. And then I'm actually going to make sure I have this lower jaw selected. I'll go ahead and hide my articulator. And come down here to paint model. And this will be easier if I hide the upper jaw. But I can go ahead and come in here and hit F on my keyboard to expand my paintbrush. I'm just going to paint out and delete this area so it doesn't get in my way. Careful I don't get the tooth. And I'll go ahead and just take a little bit off this one as well to be safe. All right. So once I've finished my check clearance, I'm going to go ahead and do my refractory model. This So once my check clearance is done, I'm going to go ahead and survey my model. And then I will commit. And I'll go ahead and do my refractory model. Now you may have noticed there's these little gaps down here. However, because they're not diastemas at the incisal edge, they should be blocked out by the refractory model. So I will check for that, but I don't feel the need to block out diastemas on this case. Let's see. As you can see, those gaps are blocked by my undercuts, so I'm not worried about them. I'd say that looks pretty good. And so now I can start to mark my splint outline. At this stage, you can do either a straight or a scalloped night guard. That preference is entirely up to the individual. I think I'll go scalloped on this one. And then straight across here on the front. Let's see. And you saw my line kind of did something weird there. It's probably just because, as you can see, these points aren't actually clicking exactly on the scans. They're on the refractory model, which is kind of this opaque shape right here. So I just added that extra point to clarify where I wanted the line to go. And now I'll just keep walking across. And then I've got my horseshoe. All right, and once you have the outline you want, go ahead and click next and pick the interior region. Confirm that trimming was successful. And then if you have this auto background checked, you won't actually need to click splint shell or minimum thickness. They'll be automatically generated. If not, you'll just click these buttons and it'll walk through those stages manually. And now we'll mark the occlusal curves. Now, marking the occlusal curves is a little bit different on a lower. So I would typically go across the incisal edge on the outside of all of these teeth in a standard upper. but we really want to try and get just the active cusps in a lower appliance so that we can reduce the bulk a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that for my maxillary and then do my mandibular. And I'm going to stay kind of just along this edge because I do want to leave a little bit of extra room to make sure I really get all of those cusps. And then of course I will check it in the preview. Once these lines are done, here I'll go ahead and hit curves only. At this stage you can kind of smooth these lines out a little bit. And check and make sure that there's the proper depth. So the lower tends to be a little lower on the teeth here. That doesn't matter as much because this is now the side that it's attaching to the splint shell. So as long as it's touching the teeth, whereas right now I don't have much depth on the upper, I'm actually going to go ahead and drag these points towards the palate a little bit so that my wax rim is taller and has plenty of room to get all of my occlusal surface later on. Because remember, this is just laying the block foundation for our wax rim. It's not going to be where the final wax is. So I'll go ahead and calculate my rim, and I like to increase the opacity. So now I can look around, and one of the big differences on how you design your lower appliances is going to be whether or not you prefer a thinner wax rim, or some people prefer to get both cusps to prevent any pinching. So I'm gonna actually expand this one right here, as I'd hate for them to bite their cheek. Just give it a little bit more wax there. As you can see, when I recalculate the rim, it automatically changes. Wasn't quite far enough. Let's see, and the one next to it maybe a little bit. So neither is technically incorrect. I've seen preferences for both. And I think I'm going to keep my wax rim as is. So once you're done, and you can hide show shell right here just to check where it's going to fall on the appliance. As you can see, it juts out pretty far. I like to make sure on my anterior upper that I have just enough wax for that MIP. So it looks like I may want to add just a little bit more depth to make sure I get this corner here on the front tooth. But it's all captured there, and I don't want it to go far out front. If for any reason your rim was farther up, like you'd clicked further out on the tooth, that just means that you're gonna probably end up scraping it off in the sculpting stage later. So now I'll go ahead and click commit and fuse rim to shell. So you see I have dual bite on this side, and then I don't quite have those outer cusps over here. So you'll be able to see what both look like at the end of the workflow. Now I'm going to block out large concavities. And we can begin marking our posterior contacts. Now, one thing to keep in mind on this lower is that my active cusps are the lingual ones now, so I'm going to want to make sure I have more contact area on those than the outer. And I'm still keeping with pretty light contact. Again, you can adjust these points to have as much or as little contact as you desire. All right, I'm going to click next. Now, the other big important difference is for my ramp, it is now going to be behind the anterior teeth. So I'm going to need to paint out and delete the area behind the front 6 instead of in front like we would do for a lower. And now I will delete painted and hit commit. Subtract our posterior plane. So if I hide the upper jaw, you can see here's my wax. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is that we only have as high as the wax goes for our surface, for our ramp. So that already does not look high enough. So that's something you'd fix at the wax room stage. Now I'm going to go ahead and generate functional surface so I can show you if yours comes out with only a little bit of ramp, and then we'll go back and go over how to fix it. Alright, so if I go ahead and hide my upper jaw, you'll see here's my ramp. Here's that surface that we're going to carve out. And if I unhide my splint shell by clicking this eyeball here, you'll see just how much surface area it's going to remove. So this one's not too bad. I will have a little bit of the ramp, but I don't have any of this contact that will be on the splint. So if you wanted to have more of that included in your ramp, you would want to go back and adjust your wax ramp. So I'll subtract functional surface so you get an idea of what that would look like. It's kind of just a straight edge ramp, but if you did want more or decide later on you wanted to change it, to do that, we're actually going to come over here to splint shell, right click and delete my splint shell. And then you can come back up and just click splint shell. Even if you have auto on, that button will still be there and you can click it and it will regenerate it. Now I can go ahead and click fuse rim to shell and it would add back the rim, but I don't want to do that. So I'm going to hit Control Z and we actually want to come into mark occlusal curves and we're going to change it a little bit. So click curves only to get into the editing mode. And now here's where I need these anterior points on my maxillary line, which is going to be the orange one, to be higher. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag these points up. Not so much the ones right here in the front. And you could even, when you get the screen line, click to add a point so that you can have more control over where exactly it would be higher. I think that's going to get me what I want, but I'll go ahead and calculate rim just to see. And one other option, so you can see it's higher in some spots, not all of them. So I'm going to go ahead and drag up all of these points to kind of a clean flush line, probably about a quarter to a third of the way up the teeth. Calculate my rim again. Increase the opacity. And that's getting me some extra wax back there to work with. Another thing that can help you get that wax in the lingual side is actually to go ahead and do a rim flare. So I'm going to do a rim flare of 20 and calculate rim. And that went in the opposite direction I wanted, so I'm going to change that to -20 and calculate rim. And you'll see it's actually going to tilt that anterior portion down at roughly a 20-degree angle. And now I have more wax here to work with for my ramp, as well as less wax here in front of these teeth, because I'm going to come in when I have my shell and I'm going to scrape a bunch of that down because we don't need that extra thickness down here. So once I have that wax where I want it, I think that's going to be pretty good. I'll go ahead and hit commit. And now I can click fuse rim to shell. And I don't need to redo my mark posterior contacts. If you click that, it will make you re-click them. But if you just click subtract posterior plane, you'll see that it cut all of that out again the exact way we had it before, but I now have much taller wax right here. So then I can subtract the functional surface and you'll see I now have a ramp that goes all the way through that wax. So I don't have the steeper incline right there. I didn't want that so much as just the full excursion. So now we have the basis of our occlusal surface. The next step is typically to sculpt. If you didn't want to do any sculpt, technically you could click grind MIP, and I'll go ahead and do that. And you'll see it cuts out our MIP on all of our contact spots right there. And that also helps me see right here, any wax in front of those MIP spots is not doing anything for us. So I will scrape most of that down just to not have excess wax that the patient doesn't need. So now I'll go ahead and go to sculpt. And the first tool I have is the scrape tool. I'll go ahead and scrape down some of these high points right here that are just little spots where there was the edge between our occlusal surface and our I'll scrape down these little spots, which were just the little areas in between where we cut this occlusal plane and where our functional surface was. So I'll scrape them down a little bit and then we'll come in and smooth them out. See, there's one over here too. Another key thing is I can see right here where there is and where there isn't data from our generate functional surface. Anywhere that wax is still kind of flat, you could smooth. If there was excursions all the way through here and you didn't want to lose any of that, one thing you could do is take the fill deepen brush and run it along here so that when we smooth that edge down, because you don't want that sharp edge, then it would keep that height in that area. But I'm going to Control Z and undo that brush stroke because we don't need any of that right there. Just maybe right here in this front little corner. I want to make sure I don't lose that. But as you can see, my actual data, and if you're unsure, you can come over here to the right side and turn on the occlusal surface and see exactly where it's in contact, but all of this area right here is not. So I'm not going to worry about anything past this point. The fill deepen brush is also great for filling in these crevices. So what the fill deepen does is it will take the high point on two edges essentially and fill in the valley in between without adding any height to the highest point. So right here at my highest point on the teeth, where it is the exact thickness of our shell, it will not increase that thickness. It'll just fill in everything between the high points of my brush. So I like to come in and kind of smooth these out just because it looks nicer, and the less crevices means the more likely they'll actually get their appliance clean and it won't build up bacteria. That's also great for cases like this where there's a missing molar on one side, because I can kind of fill in up to the edge of my wax rim, and also just fill in if they have really like deep cusps, then I can fill those cracks in easily as well. I'll kind of fill in this edge just so it's kind of graduated, but I am going to come back and scrape that in a moment. So you could come through with a smooth brush and smooth all of that out now that I've done it. I usually smooth last so that I get all of my other alterations done.